everyone. Welcome to Theories in Action, the Senior Exchange 2016. This is our 7th year of doing this. It's a conference run by the Dean of the Dean of the College, not Dean of the Conference. Really confusing. But the idea is that we have, as you know, this is the last weekend in the academic school year, so classes ended yesterday. And this is a space for seniors to kind of reflect and share their experiences. So today we're joined by Sophie, Ryan, and Tariq, who most of you know, to learn a little bit about science and hear scientists critiquing science.
Thank you all so much for coming. If anybody who's sitting in the outside circle wants to come into the inside circle, that's cool. If you want to stay there, also cool. But yeah, thank you all so much.
Yeah, and also there's like so much food, so never be hungry, just go eat it. It's not rude to get up and go get more food. I'll be doing that.
And also if you have like any questions at all, feel free to just like ask them. So first, hi, my name is Tariq. Just wanted to get started with a little body scan meditation. So just as a quick disclaimer, the body scan meditation comes from, or at least I came to it from mindfulness-based stress reduction. And that's a technique that was kind of developed from Jon Kabat-Zinn, watching and investigating Buddhist meditative traditions, Chinese meditative traditions, Hindu meditative traditions, all of these things, and kind of incorporating it all into like a more and more objective clinical application. And so like just taking in mind before we start this that it is not supposed to be like some sort of sonic pharmacology or sonic technology as like some folks would have you believe, as it being like some super healing technique, but we also want to acknowledge like kind of the tradition that this does come from originally. So if you would please entertain us and kind of sit forward on your chairs just a bit. And kind of like rest your hands either on your knees or kind of like in a circle in your lap. And slowly draw your eyes closed. And just breathe normally. Take note of your breath. And feel as you breathe in, your chest and your core expanding and contracting. Now if you'll draw your attention to your face, notice any pressure or tension, particularly behind the eyes, in the cheeks, in the jaw. Slowly try to relax those muscles. Bring your attention down to your neck and your shoulders. Again, notice any tension there. Move your way down to your chest and your back. Take note of any pressure and strain, and again try to relax. Slowly moving your attention down to your glutes. Take note of the weight of your body pressing down against the chair. And the chair pressing up. open your eyes and let light into your eyes. Let's come back together. So that was just a quick body scan. So yeah, let's just kind of go around and see how everyone feels about kind of doing and participating in that little practice.
Also, if you wouldn't mind just saying your name, yeah, so we can all sort of have a sense of who's in the room. So we just checked in with ourselves, also going to check in everybody.
And then also your name, and then we all brought in on these different tables our objects that represent like projects that are important to us or our discipline. So like if you were to if you could think of an object, it doesn't have to be academic, but just like that's significant to you and questions you're curious about.
So I guess I'll start. I've been meditating kind of on and off for a while, but the body scan meditation is definitely one of my favorites. It's like one of the easier ones to do. You can do it in like as little as 5 minutes or as much as like 30 minutes if you like. And every time that I go through, I kind of like notice different places where I'm feeling tense, and being able to like really like every time that I notice like a tense spot, I like also kind of reflect on like what's making me feel tense like that. So that's what I usually get out of this practice.
Hi, I'm Natalia. Particularly last year or so, I've been thinking a lot about like gender and whether or not I fit into gender, and so I think body scans are always an interesting place for me to be in my body and be in a body that's like sometimes confusing for me. So I think it's like it's always an interesting experience to check in with that, and but a really relaxing one. So thank you. And then the object.
Yeah.
I have a book that my sister made me when I first left home to start traveling, and it's just a book of like photos and objects of love and things she made, and sort of started like filling it in too as the year went on. So it's like my love object. So.
Hi, I'm Matt. I've been meditating on and off for about 2 years now. I normally do mindfulness breath meditation, so I don't normally do body scans. That was a nice foray into something I don't get to do too often. Very different methodology, which I enjoy. And then I'd say the object that I'm most curious about is an object that most of us carry with us at all times. That's our brains. Typically. And yeah, that's been a focus of research for mine for getting close on a decade now. Oh God.
I'm Lauren. Let's say object that's really important to me. I was at a garden on Potter's Ave this morning, and someone gave me a cilantro that decided to volunteer and grow, and I have it in a jar in my house, and the roots still have dirt on it, and that seems really exciting and representing where I am right now. I enjoyed the body scan in the sense that being here in this room, we kind of forget we're examining this outer landscape of people, and sometimes we don't realize what we're bringing to the room, whether it's the tensions that we hold or even how what our internal landscape looks like. So I appreciate the chance to stop and think about this before I look out and hear about all of you, so I can hold them both together and try and understand.
Hi, my name's Maya. Body scan was a little weird because I felt, even though we were focusing solely on the body and examining it, I felt like if I didn't move ever so slightly a part of my body, I felt like I was disembodied and I would kind of get dizzy and float up into the roof and away. Anyway, as for the objects, on my desk in my dorm room there is a little baggie of dried fly larvae, and so that would kind of encompass what I've been spending a lot of my time on these days.
I'm Brenna.
And I think the body scan is really interesting to do in this context for me at school, where we spend so much time thinking about our heads, and we kind of forget that they're connected to our body. And so there are lots of other times in my life when I feel like it's all more connected, and so it's good to remember that that's important to be connected here as well as while like working. The object, I guess, would be, I guess, thinking about how I communicate ideas to other people. That's not really an object, but that's what I
I'm Andrew. I've used body scan meditation to relax before when I'm stressed out, so I feel very relaxed right now. For the object, I think I'm similar to Sophie, and that I'm going to be starting research on plants. So that's it.
Hi, I'm Tammy. That was really great. Thank you for taking us through the body scan. I feel like I should do that more often. And whenever I do go to yoga, it's like, why don't I do this more often? It feels so good, and then I don't allow myself to. So I should try to weave it into my day better. Yeah. And an object, I don't know. Maybe this ring. It's Czech garnet. I studied abroad in the Czech Republic this time last year, and I feel like when I was there, I learned how to find the things that make me happy and to actively pursue them, and I got this ring to remind me of that.
I'm Raisa. The body scan. So I got into meditation a year ago, and then I even went to like the conference they had over there, and then I just never did it again. So this is the first time in a year, over a year. Because I was like, wow, that was like so long, like a whole day of meditation. Anyway, so yeah, I feel like this is a starting point for me getting back into it. As for object, so my computer is not at Charlotte's house, so that's an object that I'm like thinking about right now, because I'm like, oh, finals and like applying to jobs and stuff, and it's like an object that I cannot wait to like just, I don't care if it's at your house. But yeah, I guess that's what I'm thinking about.
I'm Charlotte. I was a really stressed out 7th grader. I don't know why, but I used to do body scanning. I didn't consider it meditation in order to fall asleep. Like, I couldn't fall asleep if I didn't like think about like the muscular tension I had in my brain and then in my shoulders. And once I would do like the entire body scan, I'd usually fall asleep, and I was very grateful for that as a 7th grader. And then I tried to get back into meditation because my mom got this like really catchy 8-minute meditation, like, you're not gonna waste too much time, Charlotte, just do it. Didn't last too long for me, but it's always really nice and like refreshing to do this, and I just don't realize how much I need it. And an object I've been thinking a lot is, I have a little charango, which is a Latin American like guitar, and I got it when I was in Ecuador for my birthday, and I really want to learn how to play it. I know how to just like strum the strings, but it's very different than a guitar because you have to like play it with your wrist. And most of my research focuses on Ecuador and indigenous communities, and this is a typically indigenous instrument. And I feel like I want to learn how to play it, but also the cultural significance behind it. I don't just want to be playing it. So I would love to get back to Ecuador and like actually have someone who this means a lot to teach me and share that knowledge.
So I didn't mean to disrupt the circle. Hi, I'm Hector. Body scanning is something that I wish I did more of as someone who dances recreationally. It wasn't introduced until like this semester through Monday class, where we finally started like meditating before we started dancing, because I mean it's immense to benefits to know, as Tariq said, like where you're feeling tense and why that might be, and how you could fix that through dance and other things. And an object, this camera, why not? Documenting things, history, events is important, and it also relates to how we, think about memory and memorialize things. So yeah, and thank you all for being in Theories in Action today.
I'm Kari. I like the body scan a lot. I, similarly to Charlotte, was taught by or I'm not sure if you said your mom taught you, but yeah, I was taught when I was really little to do that. But recently I've been trying to meditate a little more and been noticing how fluttery my body feels all the time inside, and I don't know what, I'm always trying to figure out what's causing that, and I'm trying to deduce whether it's like my excessive sugar intake or my mental state or what. But it's always good to just figure out what's happening. And I definitely want to use that as a tool to do so. And as an object, I mean, this is pretty banal, but my Nalgene maybe. I've been thinking a lot about what life force means and what gives people life and what gives me life. And on a basic level, I'm really thirsty all the time and really love water and like 10 of these a day. But in a more important, or maybe something that causes me a little more thought, I've been trying to think about what I can do to give other people life and how I can provide that for myself.
I'm Michael. Body scanning was interesting. I found out how distracted my mind is, and also that I definitely do have a cold. But it was very nice. I should do that more. I think as an object, I've been thinking a lot about diamonds for my thesis. I never thought I'd think so much about diamonds, but that's how it goes. So, yeah.
I'm Haley. Body scan. Yeah, I have a very short attention span and I'm a very stressed person, so that was like perfect for me. Object, probably also some books. Yeah.
Okay, I'm Stanley. Body scan was interesting. I also noticed that my mind is very distracted all the time. Always thinking about what's wrong in life and why our lives suck and stuff like that. Very fun circle. And so I think it's important to do that sometimes, but at the same time, kind of sucks when you just focus on all the things that are making you stressed out. But it's also a way to de-stress. So I think it's a good thing I should do more. An object. I'm gonna pass. Sophie, your turn.
Do you guys want to go?
I'll go ahead and go. My name is Alex. For me, I have very mixed feelings about meditation. I feel like meditation in my life has been something where I've been taught that it's a luxury that I can't really have because I have so many things to do, and I think because of the identities that I hold, I don't have the luxury to just stop and sit. I think that in my family and in my culture, there's an expectation that you keep moving and you keep pushing despite everything that's happening around you, because life doesn't stop, so why should you? Not to say that it isn't a bad thing, but I don't think it's the right thing for everybody, and I think people meditate in different ways. As far as an object that's been on my mind, I think about phones a lot. That's been what I've been paying attention to a lot for the past couple of years. A lot of the research that I did was around how young women use phones to access information readily and use phones as a gateway to knowledge, and how can especially researchers put information out there that's responsible and accurate in order to provide young ladies with the information they need to make good decisions about their health.
My name is Jesus. I thought the meditation was really interesting. I usually don't meditate, but I'm also a dancer, so it's like important. And an object that I carry around is this notebook. I research dance and notation, and so I read a lot about dance in this book.
I'm Bianca, and I have done body scans before, but they usually tend to freak me out because then I start to focus on like the things that I find most pressing in my mind. But surprisingly this time it didn't. So I felt very grounded and very like stable. So that was pretty interesting for me. And then an object I think about, not necessarily an object, but
a concept I like to think about vulnerability and how to create a space for that in order to ensure healthy socio-emotional development, especially as a teacher, going into graduate school next year, and I'm going to start student teaching. A lot of my research for my capstone focused on being able to provide a space for first-gen Latinos to be able to talk about their experiences here, and just how simply opening up allows them to feel a little more secure and validated in the things that they have gone through here.
I'm Claire, and I actually just finished my year of student teaching yesterday. It was pretty emotional, but we do a lot of meditation through a program called BASE, or Resilient Kids, in Rhode Island, and they have a representative come and lead kids through a similar body scan thing every Tuesday, Thursday, and it's a lot of the same, closing your eyes or picking a focus point, noticing your breathing, noticing things about your body. And at first I thought it was a little weird. I didn't really like it, but I think I learned to just take what I could from it and sort of slow myself down, because as a teacher you're running around all over the place and it's not fun. But when everyone's sort of sitting together and collectively taking a breath, it's really nice. And an object that I actually dreamt about last night was my backpack. And it felt so heavy, and I was running around a mall, and I had to find a papyrus. And it was really weighing me down, and I woke up this morning feeling really heavy. And I think a backpack is symbolic of I'm physically bringing knowledge to my students, but I'm also I also have to always check my own background and the things that I've learned, my biases, when I teach a diverse group of students.
I'm Bridget. I love a body scan, mostly because everyone has to close their eyes and you don't have to look at each other for 5 minutes, which is, I think, a nice way to be in a room with each other. Just start by not looking at anyone. So that's nice. And also nice if you have an anxiety disorder, which I do. So it's cool. And I think an object I've been thinking about recently is my bike. I built it myself and brought it here from where I lived before, and so now the weather's nice, and so I'm fixing it and taking care of it, and thinking about being a lady who bikes and what that means in spaces, and how it's dangerous but also fierce. So great. Yeah.
Hi, I'm Dolma. I grew up in the Tibetan Buddhist tradition, so mindfulness practices have always been conflated with thinking about my family, and so I always think about my family and my family's experiences when I am asked to do meditation. I am thinking a lot about how different people conceive of embodiment and how people think about their experiences in their body when it comes to talking about illness, and how conversations around illness are often really hard because of what different people bring to those conversations.
I'm Sophie, and I thought the body scan was really interesting. I really noticed my cheeks were really tense, which is a weird thing. And I brought flowers.
Hi everyone, my name's Emily. I learned meditation from the book Stargirl, and there was this moment where she's sitting in the desert and she's imagining this giant eraser, and from the toes, she'll erase her toes, and then she'll just basically erase her body until she floats away. And that's the conception of meditation I had since I was young. Whether I actually use it's a different story. But I like the body scan because it's the opposite of, instead of erasing your body, you're just taking great notice of what you have. So that was really interesting to me. And the object that I would put on the table is my journal, because this semester I've really allowed myself to reflect on my, interest in science in particular. And I never gave myself permission to try to pursue science, because I'm pre-med, FYI. So I this semester spent a lot of time journaling and doing a lot of self-reflection, and basically gave my permission to try and pursue science for a career.
I'm also Emily. I
really appreciated the body scan. It's been an emotionally disruptive semester for me, and I feel like I've been interested in finding new ways of emotionally supporting myself and finding other outside ways of getting that support. So I appreciate new opportunities to try new mechanisms of that. And the object that's important to me at the moment is my brother. He has a big concert on Monday, and I'm really excited to hear him play. So yeah.
I'm Emma. I thought the body scan was really interesting because I realized I'm holding tension in a lot of places I didn't expect to be holding tension, that I was more relaxed in places I usually hold tension. And an object I've been thinking a lot about is maps, and how maps attempt to represent something and to communicate something. In particular, for a final paper, maps of space, like outer space, not just space more broadly, and what those maps do to how we understand and how we think about space and place in the world.
Hi, my name's Dawn. I thought the body scan was great. Mostly just, I think a few other people said, it's nice to just focus on one thing instead of thinking about 2 or 3 things at the same time, and just focus in general. So it was great focusing on the body. My object, I guess, and this is not a cop-out because I'm holding it, would probably be my coffee cup or my thermos, because I literally always have it with me. People used to identify me back when I was a graduate student by Shilin with the mug. Yeah, that's her. A big plastic green one, in fact, that I just retired. And it also reminds me of my background. I worked through school and spent 10 plus years at a coffee diner, and so I think it's also, and it's always full of coffee. So I think it's also kind of a link to my history and a security blanket.
Again, I'm Ryan. I feel like the body scan is something I so rarely do, but I really appreciated being led through it, and I always feel like even though I'm focusing internally, it's a really wonderful time to listen and be led by somebody else. And my objects, I brought in these 2 books. They have to do with medical mycology, which is like fungus stuff. Yeah.
Hi, my name is Helen. Unfortunately, I missed the body scan, so I don't know what we're talking about. But I guess an object that I've been thinking about a lot is my car, because I just bought it, and thank you. And I've been thinking a lot about what it means to be mobile and have access to different spaces.
Was there anyone else who trickled in who just wanted to introduce themselves and maybe talk about an object? And also, feel free to pass if you would rather not.
Yeah, Janice. Object I've been thinking about are rocks that fit really well in your hand because they fit really well in your hand.
Thank you all for sharing. Really appreciate that, and for participating with this. Hopefully we'll be able to incorporate stuff like this a lot more throughout our kind of presentation, but more along the lines of a workshop. Yeah, again, my name is Tariq, and I realized I didn't really share what my object was, and that is this thing. It's a tactile simulator that I made for my lab over the summer and have been working on throughout the semesters to kind of turn into my capstone project. And I feel like that's like a perfect segue for me to be able to really talk about my project. So I've been researching with Catherine Kerr, who studies meditation, and especially meditation as a segue to neuroscience. And understanding the overarching theme for our lab is really starting to understand what it means to be embodied and what embodiment really is. So our kind of working definition, or at least my working definition that I've kind of come to, is just that kind of amalgamation of your sensory input that kind of makes up your holistic experience. So visual input, with this being tactile input, so how something touches your fingertip and how you can experience that. And so being able to, science loves numbers, and so being able to try to quantify that as much as possible to be able to communicate those experiences, because our experience of our own sensory input is so private. It's not very easy to communicate in general. So, yeah.
Do you have any slides or anything?
No.
I just have some slides because my project's like mostly visual. So I do classics and environmental studies, and there's like a lot of pictures here, but I'll be pretty brief. So I am really interested in like the language of botany and how that actually shapes the field and like the experiences of inclusivity in STEM, and like also just like how that's layered in with the actual words that we use and the histories that have shaped that. And so like basically my bottom line is like plants are gendered, and that's pretty weird and doesn't make any sense. The language of invasion, I study invasive earthworms, is like really fraught, xenophobic, and racially charged, and there's a lot of exotification that happens in the language. And so I decided to approach this from an by creating a set of illuminated manuscripts, because I, having studied classics, the medieval time period is a time that connects like the ancient European past to the present, and that was really a time when botany began to take its form that it has today. And so my project focuses on how a lot of the Roman Empire's conception of Romanness and otherness shaped how they talk about plants, and how through the British Empire that's carried through to the language we use today. And so we're talking about objectivity. The first image in my series is an illuminated self-portrait. Science has always been framed to me as like, you're this objective scientist, but I'm not. I'm a lot of things, but I'm not an objective scientist, and I still do science, and so that was like really important for me to think about how my identity fits into my research and where I do my research. So I conducted ecology research in Western Massachusetts in the town of Stockbridge, and that was research conducted on lands that were stolen from Native peoples. And so I think that's like really important to recognize when you're an ecologist doing research in America, that no matter where you are, like I'm a white female ecologist and I'm working on stolen lands. And so there's a history of genocide built into the field of natural history. And also I did cyanotypes and cutouts of plants as a nod to two British female artists and scientists, Mary Delaney and Anna Atkins, because especially Mary Delaney didn't receive the recognition they deserve, and it's really common, this use of amateur in natural history, like, oh, they were just these women who collected flowers, but you have these like men who are businessmen and pastors who were actually scientists, even though like they were both doing the same thing. But they were also complicit in a lot of ways in this system of European natural history, and so I wanted to use these two art forms to acknowledge kind of how I fit into this as a scientist critiquing science, and as a white female ecologist. And so this manuscript, which is on some side, I don't know. This is about kind of introducing a lot of the themes that I deal with, and it's in the middle. There's an outline of the American beech tree, which, if you've read the Eclogues, which are written by Virgil, is about land ownership and empire and a lot of the strife associated with that, and he talks about the European beech tree. And so in naming this native plant in America, Fagus, you're applying this Roman word to it, and also at the same time erasing the names that native peoples gave to it, while also taking over the land. And Daniel Boone, who's this kind of hero of Manifest Destiny, even though he was a murderer and horrible, he's celebrated in a lot of ways. He carved his names into beech trees, so the beech tree carries a lot of weight in terms of its significance in representing this relationship between the classical world and colonialism through the British Empire. And I also, marginalia was a tradition that was used in the scriptoria of the scribes, where you have like the monks writing things like these Book of Kells type stuff. But they would also like get bored because they're just writing all day, so they would write stuff in the margins. And so I used the margins as a site for me to ask questions and critique a lot of things, and then also bring out the marginalized histories and kind of decenter this myth that's been built up around narratives of discovery. And so I have a lot about kind of pairing things about redlining with urban gardening, and I cut up a lot of gardening magazines like Enjoy Your Garden, and just kind of grassroots ecology in this article about like soil culture, yet there's no talk about real culture and valuing culture and people. So I thought that was really interesting. And I've written in the margins like my own questions about like who, because there's this narrative of the fathers of botany, and it's like Theophrastus and Linnaeus, and that's it, and it's these two white guys, and plants have been around for 500 million years, and if you Google mother of botany, nobody comes up, and so there's like all of these things, and it's like, that's ridiculous. There are plants all over the world. Not only Romans got to name plants, yet those are the only names we scientifically recognize. And so this is a piece about Rome, and it's based off of an image, a mural in Pompeii in the Villa of Livia, and it's talking about three plants: pepper, balsam, and I never remember the third. Cinnamon. And so pepper and cinnamon were originally from India, and through imperial expansion, the Romans had contact with India, but so these spices became staples in their diet, but they exotified Indian cultures and were really vague in the way they talked about the cultures, and like by Pliny, who's one of these fathers of natural history. And so there's this is kind of where the roots of exotification, and when we think about invasive species today, we use the words like exotic and invasive. And describing tropical plants but when they come to America, they're labeled and they can become naturalized. And so I think like there's a really big connection in the way in the Roman world they talked about these plants because of the British Empire's kind of glorification of the Roman Empire. And then also for the plant balsam that was from the land of Judea, when the Roman Empire conquered it, they brought the plant back in the same, a really cool classicist did this analysis of the language that was used, and she found that they used the same words to talk about this plant from a conquered place as they used to talk about slaves they brought back from conquered places. So there's this oppression built into the language of natural history. And so all of the medieval manuscripts were basically just recopied versions of Pliny. So it's literally directly handed down, and natural history is built off of these ideas. And so then the other wonky thing about plant collecting is you do it in newspapers, which is like the greatest irony of all time, because you have like this document that has all of these really salient articles, and obviously media is fraught in a lot of ways, but it's a lot more relevant than like a plant stripped of its context on a page. And so you collect the plants in these newspapers because they're the right size, and then you mount them for an herbaria. You flatten them and you give them this label that contains like the plant's elevation, and you collected it from this hillside, and the plant was originally named by some white dude, and that's it. And so I just kind of wanted to herbaria specimens, imagine like a pressed plant in the center, this is totally blank and a little label in the corner. And so I wanted to like make my own version and like re-illuminate them and write stuff in the margins to kind of point out some of the flaws and ways to reimagine herbarium specimens. And so these images ask a lot of questions about kind of the intersection between race and gender in these images, and the exotification that occurs. And so this one is, and all of these newspapers directly come from the herbarium. I or my friends collected plants in them. And so this was an article that was about the Ray Kelly report that I collected a plant in. This plant is Epipactis hellebore. It's an invasive orchid. And so it just kind of bringing these questions into context and showing that there is a direct relationship because of how imperial expansion worked and how botanists were a really big part of that, taking plants for profit and oppressing and enslaving peoples at the same time. This article is directly related to the plant in a way that science tries to push itself away from, and so I'm just trying to bring these two things together to show the direct relationship. There was this really lovely quote about objectivity being a false god, and it was like ironic to do science with that. And then I'm also really interested in narratives of discovery. I cut up and yelled at a lot of National Geographic articles that like to pretend that America was this place to be discovered. Like own a piece of the Wild West was an advertisement they have in there, and there's just like a lot of really troubling things. And same with this piece, I have these cyanotypes that I made of native and invasive plants and the different ways that's used to talk about them without ever mentioning people. And so gender was also something I was really interested in, and how this fits in the exotification of plants that occurs at the same time that we label them as male and female. And so I was like sitting in this classroom and we're learning about plant reproduction, and all of a sudden plants are male and female. And I was like, what? Like, what? Plants may look like vaginas, but like, I don't know. And so then when you go back and look at how the Linnaean system of classification created by Carl Linnaeus happened, he classified plants based off of sexual characteristics, and he was this pastor who was really into the marriage bed metaphor, and he was like, these reproductive parts are like a man and woman sleeping in bed together. And that was like literally what's become embedded into our scientific discourse. And so I wanted to play around with that idea, and so all the keys featured in the cyanotypes actually come from the herbarium, so they represent who has access to natural history, but on top of that I also was interested in kind of like these like floral lacy underwears and suggestive plants surrounded by these quotes from gardening magazines, and like I cannot make this up. The irresistible epidemium, exquisite flowers, delicate foliage, and easy dispositions make them perennials to pant for. And then like the advertisement, what to do with stuff your wife won't let you bring into the house, or this quote from Michael Pollan in this article about orchids, like what I learned of the prostitute orchid forced me to revisit my estimation of what a clever plant was capable of doing to a credulous animal. Like roses for hips, like this picture. There's just like a lot that's going on in these gardening magazines, and at the same time they have all of these seed varieties that like use the word oriental, and these are like seed magazines from 2014 using the word oriental to describe plants ambiguously from Asia, and like these horrible uses of gender and race that are built into these plant names. And like these are things that people like, if you find them in gardening magazines, like please like cut them up because they're horrible. I like yelled at them for a very long time. And so then I also at the herbarium had these 3 newspapers that were from February 6th, 1969, and the topics that were in these newspapers spoke directly to the same newspapers that I used to collect plants. And they speak directly to like a lot of the issues I've talked that have been built into not only like the racialized language, but the experiences of people who are not straight white men in STEM. And so, for example, there's articles in the center one about the kind of the juxtaposition of, and this is an op-ed page, and it's about how freedom of speech is threatened by Black Power. Ring a bell for any op-eds we've had recently in the past couple years at Brown. And so then I put on top of that from like a seed magazine. These are literally the flower name is black and white minstrel flowers, and it's like really horrifically racialized names. This flower is described as the blackest flower we've ever seen, and like there's like pretty upsetting description below it. And so I put some current newspapers also on top of this that have impressions of plant on them. This is about Simmons inaugurating the Slavery and Justice Center, and this is about kind of the lack of inclusivity and isolation that occurs in STEM at Brown. And so just to kind of show how all of these things are related. And so like this project wouldn't have been possible with a lot of people, and like also like this is like a beginning. I realized in what ways am I reproducing the problems I'm trying to solve. This project was heavily Western centric based off of like what I had access to. I'm also like a white scientist, so I realized there's like a lot of positionality going on there. So like if you have any feedback at all or any questions or critiques, like this is something I care a lot about as a scientist and would like really love people's feedback.
Sweet. You just have one more person you have to listen to. So in any case, like, whereas Tariq has been thinking about embodiment through the lens of neuroscience and also like contemplative studies, and Sophie's thinking about sort of like connections between histories of colonialism or oppression and botany and like specifically the language of science. My project was doing a lot of thinking about infectious disease biology and approaching it through a poetic lens. And I think for me, like, why do I even care about this? It's like, I don't know. Like, it's sort of strange. I don't know. When I go into, like, an infectious disease biology class, like, I don't know what it is about my brain that likes the way that those things look. Like, like, I'm in those classes being taught, like, these mechanistic, small-scale interactions. Like, for some reason, like, that clicks with me. I like it. On the other hand, like, being in these biology classes or being in other classes in other departments that touch on biology, like, the histories associated with biology are so fraught. And so, like, again, like, we're talking about how to ground our research in subjectivity and think about like who we are coming into the room as a scientist. Like for me being like a cis-het white male studying biology at Brown, like I have a lot of questions to ask of myself, and I definitely like have a lot of questions about why is it that I've been attracted to this field. And I really haven't felt like the traditional like research methodologies or even like venues within my science classes have given me space to try and like hold questions of beauty like within biology with questions of oppression or histories or really like any cultural context. And so in my other classes that have been more like literature focused or poetry focused, that for me has been a realm that's allowed me to like negotiate and navigate multiple truths in a way far more honestly, I think, than like, I don't know, any biology class I've taken here. So my project is sort of coming out of this capstone project for my biology concentration that is like a collection of visual poetry that I've been writing and making. And so, yeah, all of this started a little while ago. I'm just gonna like flash up some images of some of the poems that I've been working on to touch on sort of three main themes going through it. I think one is like when you open any sort of like infectious disease biology or like microbiology textbook, like they end up looking sort of similar. The formatting choices, all of this stuff. And for me, I realized that like when I was looking at these, I was like, whoa, like there's a lot of possibilities here. Like what if you like smashed a poem on top of that? Like where does it fall? Or like, I don't know, like maybe, yeah, I do want to get some like actual information about a disease, an organism, like an epidemiological question, but also like, are there other ways to interpret this knowledge or other ways to engage with it and also other ways to present it? Because I have a lot of friends who like, they open a book like this and they do not feel welcome. They're like, nope, like this is not for me. Like I can't, for whatever reason, like this isn't something that feels right for me. And for whatever reason, like this is something, like opening these types of books, this is something that has felt right to me. And so I'm trying to like envision ways to communicate, engage with, and present this like same realm of knowledge, but through a poetic lens, because that also feels like the way that I have been thinking about it, whether or not I've been writing it that way. So yeah, these first couple of poems are just sort of thinking about literally like layout. Like if you open a textbook, like what are you seeing, and how can I then like either actually take text out of existing books or write my own text to be able to engage with these things on a poetic level and a scientific level simultaneously. Yeah, I could give context, but I also realize we don't have a ton of time. But essentially, like, this poem is thinking about this organism called a schistosome, which is a parasitic organism. So schistosomiasis is the disease in question here. And these are thinking about these different types of fungi. I don't know why, but I got like very into fungi over the last couple months and have been thinking a lot about fungi. I don't know if there's anyone else out here, but so these are all a class of fungi called dermatophytes, which essentially means that they like live on our skin. So like fungi are like all over the place, but some fungi also can live on our skin. And there are certain types of dermatophytic fungi that are called anthropophilic dermatophytic fungi. Those guys like are the only class of fungi that literally have to live on our skin. Like they have adapted so that like that is their home, right? So I was particularly interested in those guys, so I spent a lot of time thinking about that class of fungi. But then like the more that I started thinking about these like format questions, like if I open a textbook, what does it look like? How can I smash a poem on that? Then I was like, well, how can the poems that I smash on these textbooks like start to perform the actions that these diseases do, or that these processes do, or that these research methodologies do? So this is one that's thinking about this process called epilation to combat these like fungal infections of the scalp, and this particular fungal infection becomes important later, but in any case, like taking hair and like little by little, like ripping it out, or eventually like using X-ray radiation to like kill the follicular cells that allow for hair to grow, so that at the end you end with like something very sparse and you're able to cure yourself. But that was sort of the start. Then the question came like, actually if I'm thinking about biological mechanisms of disease, like what are the ways that language itself, not just in its format, but like literally how can I perform these mechanisms and talk about them at the same time? So this is one example, thinking about the causative agent of this disease called valley fever that's really prevalent in the Southwest where I'm from. So for whatever reason, it's like something that's been part of my like world, like valley fever is something I hear about, read about in the newspaper. My friends with dogs who have valley fever. But in any case, I got really excited because valley fever is another fungal infection, but it has this property called thermal dimorphism, which essentially, like big picture, what that means is depending what temperature this fungi is at, it grows differently. So in certain circumstances, it grows more like in a web type thing. And in other ones, it grows as a spore. So it's just like this little thing that whoop, like divides, whoop, like. So literally like the same organism, just temperature dependent. So that means like if it's in the soil, it's growing a certain way, and then it gets in your body, like whoa, things heated up, and like now it's growing differently, and that actually is central to its pathology. So one of the things that I was thinking about is like, what is in language the closest thing to that? What I could think about was an anagram. So you have the same word, or same letters, reorganized, so it's the same material but performing a different action. And so this is the full name, and we can ask questions given like Sophie's presentation, like why is this the name that shows up for us? But like we can take that name, reorganize the letters, and learn something about the ways that this disease actually functions. Also at the top, these are all like statements that reinterpret what thermal dimorphism is. So I was thinking also like anagrams, but also restatements or rephrasing. This is another one. Again, thinking about like how do we normally interact with these like schematics of infectious disease or virus or whatever particles, but also like the particulars of HIV, like that's something that we've probably all heard of, but in terms of like the way that biologists think about HIV, it's like this huge paradigm shifter. It's something called a retrovirus. So for a long time, there's this thing called the central dogma of biology. I don't know if any of you have ever heard that in your biology classes. I definitely know every biology class I've been in, someone mentioned central dogma, which is this idea that our genetic information is held in a certain form, changed into another form, and then changed into a protein, and that's like what we actually have going on. So it's going from something called DNA to RNA to protein. These guys, retroviruses, they store their information in RNA, rely on this reversal to go from RNA to DNA, then to RNA to protein. So it's this moving from RNA to DNA to RNA. To me, that felt a lot like a palindrome. Like in language, if you're reading something, you read it one way, it goes right back the other way, it reads the same. So that was sort of my starting point for thinking about how can I approach retroviruses and HIV in particular from the perspective of a palindrome. And so this poem has like a number of palindromes written into it. For instance, here, an RNA, DNA, and an RNA, like that is the process of reverse transcription or retroviral replication. That itself is a palindrome. Also in these things going around the side, which like technically are called surface glycoproteins, but that doesn't really matter. The point is, it says part alive, evil a trap. That's a palindrome as well. And when we think about a virus, it's something that in many conversations I've been a part of surrounding viruses, it's like this thing that's almost alive because it's not able to reproduce on its own. It like literally requires something else's cells to be able to do that, but yet it still has like all of this really incredible force. In any case, so I did a number of poems that were thinking really closely about how to take biological mechanism into poetic or literary like mechanisms, using those as poetic constraints. But I'd say that like, I'm just gonna skip through a couple of these. I'd say that the last sort of range of poems or last sort of theme that I was thinking about comes to I think really why we're here today, is thinking about who are the people performing this biology and who are the people on whom research is being performed. And so I started thinking a lot about the scientists who were doing research, the scientists who were not mentioned who were doing research, and also the people who research was being performed on in a lot of cases of medical experimentation, which again gets back to this like question I have, like why am I studying this field that has such a violent history and continues to have violent history? But this is one example of me trying to break down this idea of a scientist being completely separate from their object of study, where like the same descriptions or words that we might use to describe, this guy is named David Gruby, he's important if you're interested in fungi. But yeah, like a lot of the ways that he describes the objects he's looking at, like if we were to put him in a portrait, would also describe him, which felt to me sort of exciting. And I'll skip through this one, but this is another dude who celebrated but rarely talked about like what does it actually mean for him to be performing science. And I sort of just want to end on this one. This is this guy named Domingo Escura. His head is pictured here. I know it is sort of gruesome, but I also want to like highlight the history. This is the guy, when we were talking about Valley Fever, he was the original like sort of subject case in Argentina, and there was this Dr. Alejandro Posadas that was like researching with him. He was an undergraduate performing research on this dude over the course of like 7 years until he died. And so after that, they preserved his head in sort of the equivalent of what you might think of like a pickle jar or something like that. It's like sitting in the lobby of this medical school in Buenos Aires. And so I felt like this was a moment to really like linger and think about the ways in which like we objectify the people oftentimes we are researching, and the fact that this guy's head sits there without context. Domingo's head is there just for people to walk by and say like, oh, Valley Fever, not, oh, Domingo Escura, like who was he? What was he doing before this whole experiment? Why was an undergrad allowed to like literally like research on him, practice on him? And that's a trope that like continues to this day. Some of my other poems are thinking about specifically the medical experimentation surrounding syphilis. I know a lot of us have maybe heard about in the United States the Tuskegee experiment. I follow really quick. I'm just going to show this. Yeah, so like this is a poem that follows this dude, John Charles Cutler, who was performing similar experiments to the experiments that are going on at Tuskegee in Guatemala. There are some primary differences between the two studies that I think are important, but I'm not going to get into now. But it's important to know that these two studies were going on at the same time. The Tuskegee experiment went on over the course of a number of decades. And this guy, after leaving these experimentation, like, things he was doing in Guatemala that were, like, horribly racialized, horribly, like, gendered, and just, like, straight up violent, he became the head researcher at Tuskegee for the last decade or so. And so I think, like, in any case, like, this project has allowed me in the, like, most active way to hold the multiple truths that I've been feeling in studying biology of, like, wow, like, I find some of this stuff really beautiful. On the other hand, like, these things are attached to histories that are very heavy and also continue to this day. So that's sort of where I've been going. Sorry, I'm just gonna do the last little thing. It's like, I've been showing you a lot of two-dimensional things. I've also been building some poetic sculptures, whatever that means, I don't know. This one actually is gonna be turned into a poetic sculpture. I'm working on it right now, but like this is this like ragtag thing, but is thinking about the development of the smallpox vaccine, both as a celebration of this is the only vaccine to have successfully eradicated a human disease from like the entire world. But on the same hand, like when we think of smallpox, what are the histories that we are also reminded of or told to forget? Or if I'm in a class about vaccines and learning about smallpox, are we going to talk about smallpox being used as a tool of genocide? Like those are questions that like I have been trying to ask through this process and feel like poetry is giving me like really clear tools how to juxtapose and ask these things to interact actively and ask people who are approaching questions of biology who maybe normally wouldn't to be holding these things at the same time. So like just a brief rundown here, we have like essentially what is a mobile but also is pointing us towards the idea of a phylogenetic tree, which is in biology the way that we represent sort of evolutionary relatedness, or also just generally like how closely related are two different species, two different groups of things. And when we think about vaccines, and in particular the smallpox vaccine, that idea of close relatedness but not being the same exactly is so important, that you need to have an imperfect reflection of the real disease, because if you give yourself the real disease, well then you have the real disease. But if you have something that's close enough, then like your body can be tricked into thinking it's seen it before, and you're like, oh, all right, cool, I've done this, and you can like, build immunity. So the smallpox vaccine is this thing against which all other vaccines are measured in some ways, that it's like, have you achieved full eradication? Yes? No. The answer is no. Only smallpox has. Or like, where on that scale are you? But at the same time, like the connecting threads here are a nod to this particular like incident that was at Fort Pitt, which is in the Northeast, but by these English soldiers who like we have documentation were intentionally giving smallpox blankets and also like a handkerchief with the intent of like infecting members of the Delaware tribe as like literally just like an act of genocide. And so in any case, this is just another example of ways that I'm trying to hold multiple truths at once while also engaging with the beauty of biology. So yeah, thanks for listening.
And so for the last few minutes, we have like some objects on the tables, and so if you guys want to like maybe wander around and find someone who you don't know and like take a couple minutes to like share how your discipline or like your lens on that like approaches that, and then after a couple of minutes we'll let you know, and we can like gather around the butcher paper to discuss what people wrote and like what thoughts are after this hour. So does that sound good? I really like not the be all and end all.
I feel really happy that you all are thinking so much about that, because so many scientists around just so do the opposite.
Something that's interesting subjective and not objective are written right next to each other.
That's beautiful. I didn't even notice that.
But I think it's interesting as far as like science being able to create narratives and truths in their own way. And even though like it's supposed to be a medium where you can objectively find conclusions, inherently it's not.
I also think it's interesting to think about how it's been valorized above these sorts of ways of looking at the world that you sort of both took into account, all of it actually, and how, like, even in terms of just logistically, like the way that schools are funded and things are happening in the U.S. to change the way that our education system works. Science is becoming more important, and it's also becoming less critically examined, at least a lot of times in the way that teachers that I talk to are discussing it, and thinking about how projects like this can influence the way that trajectory happens.
I think science is often thought of as an inherent good, while there are choices to be made within science that influence, or just like how you develop a program within science says a lot about what your values are and often those values are very one-sided.
Like the one way of knowing comment a lot, because we kind of, especially in the U.S. and Western societies in general, we like kind of precipice all of our knowledge within science, and also science is inherently fallible. So like the more that you start to recognize where things are wrong and start stripping away approaches, it's almost like a Tower of Babel in some ways like that. So kind of being conscious of that and knowing that there are other ways of knowing the world around us.
That's part of the reason why I love your project about embodiment happening in the lab, because it's like almost just like inherently subversive in the sense that like it's like about embodiment, which is like the scientists try to like get away from so much.
It's maybe a good segue into just thinking about like who are the people that we consider scientists who are doing science? How can we think about that more broadly?
Put into a box. What does that mean?
Oh no, sometimes.
Okay. I think it's interesting. Anyone who is willing to pursue their questions versus pursuing the questions of communities that are being worked on. Because if you're conducting research, my question is always is who's that research for? Is that for yourself to satisfy your curiosity, or is that to help others?
Also, off that, the next phrase in that sentence, there are questions with a critical eye, and thinking about how criticality does and doesn't play into the way we do science. The way you guys were critical is a lot different than I think the way that the critical eye is often thought of.
Also, I feel like that could totally apply to a historian or like anybody, like a parent, like
photographer.
And that's exciting. Like maybe all those things are also science in their own ways.
I think it's interesting that in that one there's a lot about like belief and faith, but in this one there isn't as much of that. And I guess like when you take it to a broad level, it's easy to see how it's like sort of a belief system or a faith system, or like an ideology. But on a micro level, like like within a person, that's a little less present. It seems. Which really difference from what that says about like how we frame responsibility, and like maybe the need to have more of a sense of individual responsibility as well as responsibility for discipline.
And in that context, the word methodological is on this twice. This is talking about method, and that's talking about belief in a really interesting, divided way.
People are coming in.
Gotcha. Well,
Thank you guys
all
so much.
Yeah.
My goal today was like when we were like all going around, we were like, what do we want? And I was like, I want to learn things. and I learned so much from everyone. And so thank you for making that happen.